Hello, friends. My guest today is Kira Deneen. She is a genetic counselor, a prenatal genetic counselor at that. And she's also host of the DNA Today podcast, which she's been doing for the last almost 10 years. And wow, she's just a wealth of information when it comes to running a successful podcast, in addition to genetics in general, because that's her job. And being that I'm a guy and I can't have babies, I this is an amazing opportunity for me to get exposed to the prenatal pregnancy aspect of DNA sequencing and the type of screening that a new mother would potentially want to consider when when first getting pregnant, or even before, when couples are wanting to kind of get an idea of the potential risks that they may pass on to a child that they may have. So this is a great episode to get a deep dive into that particular world. I learned a lot of new stuff. I don't really talk about the human side of genetics very much because my world is sort of fungi focused. So it's pretty cool to like switch gears a little bit and take what I know about the fungi world and try to transpose that into the human world. And it's both DNA at the end of the day, just different numbers of chromosomes and genes and whatnot, but fundamentally the structures are the same. So I'm just incredibly thankful. I hope everyone is having an amazing start to the new year. I have a lot of exciting projects going on, and I hope to do more YouTube videos pretty soon. I've just been really stuck with trying to figure out how I want to do it. And they're a lot of work, so I want to make sure that if I do a YouTube video, that it ends up being worth the time that it goes into doing it. And I think with a lot of these things, I just need to start. That's what people tell me. Just start and put something out there, and you'll figure it out. But anyways, this is a pretty cool podcast. Really honored to have Kira join me. She didn't have to do this. All my guests, they're so well respected in their areas and in many ways way more experienced. And it takes, I think, an openness to be able to go on someone else's podcast that you don't know who's just getting started with it. Um, I just have nothing but gratitude for so many of these kind people that um, honor me with their presence. So, without further ado, Kira Deneen, folks. Well, Kira, thank you so much for being on the Everyman Bio podcast. It's a new podcast, and I guess I want to start off with congratulating you on your recent award for, I think it's Best New Science Podcast.
Yeah, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast and
Yeah,
what you do?
yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for having me on, Josh. So my podcast is DNA Today, and it explores genetic concepts that really span all of genetics. So I'm a genetic counselor, so a lot of the episodes focus on genetic counseling because that's the world I'm in. But it's interesting when we, scope out of that. But it's really designed for anyone that's interested in genetics. So not just people that are doing that career wise, but just if you find genetics to be intriguing, the show's definitely for you. So we've been producing episodes for the past 9 years. So we have like over 140 full episodes and then a bunch of lessons that the show started with. So certainly there's an episode for everybody out there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think this is going to be episode 11 or 12. But so it makes me feel better to know because when I listen to your podcast, there are a lot of things about it that are definitely more refined than mine. And that's just because I'm new to it and it's always a work in progress.
And every
But
show has their own feel. So, like, some shows are more scripted and some are like super produced, which requires like so many people too. And then some shows are like this, more laid back, and you feel like you're hanging out with the guests more than like professionally learning from them. So, I like listening to all kinds of different podcasts.
that's
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah, that's definitely more my style. Is it's a lot of work to do a podcast, and one of the things that, like you said, you've been doing it for 9 years, and that, in my mind, puts you as like one of the first podcasters because podcasting is not that old. But if you started 9 years ago, like that was like spot on timing. How did you come up with this idea and get started with it?
Yeah. So I just remember I was going on a trip and I was like, okay, I'm going on a plane. Like, how am I going to entertain myself for all this time? And so, being the nerd I am, I searched like Harry Potter into back when it was what the iTunes store or something that it was called back then. And this podcast comes up and I was like, oh, okay, maybe it's like a couple of minutes. And it was like an hour long. I'm like, who would ever listen to an audio for an hour? Like, you're just sitting there listening. And then I listened to it and I was like, wow, this is actually really interesting. You feel like you're hanging out with the host and you're learning from them. And so from that, and then I found out that those hosts, Andrew Sims is the lead host of that. And so they're still doing the podcast today. It's called MuggleCast. And so from that, just hearing that they started it in high school, I was like, oh, well, I'm in high school. Why don't I try this out? And here we are now 9 years later, and I'm still doing it. So yeah, that was kind of the start of it. And just as for me, a way to explore the field of genetics and see what careers I might want to go into. So it kind of started out as just like a journey for myself to figure out, okay, I heard of genetic counseling. Do I want to go into that? Is there other areas of genetics that might be more interesting to me or fit me better? So it was really an excuse to be able to talk to people in the field and figure out and learn from them and say, okay, is this where I'm headed? And just be able to like educate myself along with the process, which just seemed like what you're also doing the show, that you're able to learn from your guests that come on.
100%. I mean, that's one of my favorite things to do is talk to people like yourself, and just like the breadth of people that you get to talk to is really cool. And the podcast gives you sort of an excuse to talk to people that otherwise you wouldn't cross paths with. So
Right.
I love that aspect of it. And I think that's so cool that you started the podcast when you were in high school before you really knew what it is that you wanted to do, and you just stuck with it all this time. Has that been challenging? I mean, were there ever times where you're like, why am I still doing this? Do I want to keep
Yes.
doing this?
Yeah, I think the beginning was, at first it was like, okay, I ended up getting high school credits for it. And so that was part of like the project. And then, I graduated and I was like, well, I guess I could just like keep it going and see, what I end up doing with it. But it's, you get to certain points where you're like, okay, I need to reinvent it somehow. I need to make it more interesting. And, look to see like how it's fitting in with your life too. And just, sometimes you feel like with a podcast that you've been doing for a while, or even just as you're getting that footing that first year or so and figuring out like what your space is, can be really challenging, and just getting guests on and being able to sell yourself, especially when you're starting a podcast, for people to come on and they want to ask who else has been on the show, or how many episodes do you have, how many listeners do you have? And it's hard to say, well, I'm just starting, but everybody has to start somewhere. So it's definitely been something that, the show has certainly changed as I've grown. So the beginning episodes are me researching topics and then saying, okay, I'm learning about karyotypes, and then I'm presenting on the show, like, what is a karyotype? And then you kind of go through, and then I'm actually in a program where I'm learning how to karyotype and I get certified in that. So, going through it started out me really being just along with the listener, learning with them. And now I've kind of transitioned more into a role of being a science communicator, in that I'm helping to bring knowledge to people, and that, in the interviews now I'm a little bit more participating and adding information instead of just adding questions. So it's certainly like, I would cringe listening back to early episodes, but you start somewhere, and, it's in some ways it's like, wow, look at how far we've come. And I think that can be a really cool aspect of podcasting, and just kind of documenting your journey and your career.
That is really cool. And you touched on something that I'm going through as well, which is, so it's kind of cool to hear it. And that is that like life is happening while we're producing this thing. And in your own journey, your podcast sort of reflected where you were in life at that time. And that's pretty neat. And I think, yeah, 9 years, right? Like I'm probably like a few months into my podcast. So it's so hard for me to imagine what life will be like in 9 years, or if I'll still be
Yes.
doing it.
But having a science show, you never run out of topics. Like some people would say, like, how do you keep talking about genetics? I'm like, how do I stop talking about genetics? That's a better question of like, how is it only 25 minutes? Like I could go on and on. And, sometimes I do. And I'm like, all right, let's edit some of this out. But yeah, it's definitely figuring out, I think for podcasters or, people that are interested in these topics, it's like, okay, figuring out something that's going to keep you engaged for years to come when it comes to your career, comes to a podcast.
Definitely, definitely. So when you first started, was it just you doing it by yourself, or yeah, you were
Yeah.
doing it at the high school?
So I was doing it from my parents' house pretty much. And so I had just bought some equipment to be able to record, and, very basic things. And even like, I didn't have a mic stand at first. So I just had like a big stack of books, and I was like, okay, this works. Let's tape it down. And so very like DIY. So, that's kind of how it started. And I did have a co-host at that time. And so we would take bioethic conversations and take debates, and we'd say, okay, there's two sides to this. Let's both take a side and argue it out on air. So that, it didn't matter like if we actually believed those things or that was our thoughts behind it. But just to be able to, get the just down with podcasting. And then once I, graduated from high school, then, moving on to college, that's when I was doing the show by myself and then joined the radio station so that it could start being live broadcasts every week.
Yeah, is that a college radio station that you joined?
Yeah, it is. Yep. So it's a college radio station and it's also like a community radio station. So it serves both. So people that live in the area that are radio hosts can certainly have a show and have had shows for many years. So I was fortunate enough to be able to join them my second year of college. So the show kind of had 2 years before it was officially on air as a radio show. And that's where I started numbering the episodes. So the ones before that are more like mini lessons and
Okay.
kind of, I think of those as like the bonus episodes, the early years.
I mean, I imagine getting that exposure to being in a real radio station and people who've been doing it a while was like, that must have really helped you ramp up your production skills and improve the quality of the production.
Yeah, definitely, because I was doing it live from the studio. So I suddenly had, top of the line microphones and all of this stuff. I didn't know what half the knobs did and all that. I'm like, oh, this is the volume, this is the gain. Okay, I've got that. But it was certainly exciting to be surrounded by people that also had talk shows or also had music shows and learning from them and just, the nerves of like, okay, I'm about to be live on air. There's no edit button live on air, So that was definitely a different aspect of it and just having to prepare a show every week on top of college. So that was certainly kind of, those early years were definitely like a lot of just you throw yourself into it and see what works, what doesn't work and learn as you go.
Where does the podcasting fit into your world today? Is it like your full-time job working on DNA Today, or are you doing it on the side while you do genetic counseling?
So it's kind of on the side. My main role is as a prenatal genetic counselor. So I work at a private practice, meeting with pregnant people and talking about genetic testing and options and talking about high risk pregnancies. So the show has been something that's always been like an ongoing project, and now it's a company. And so now I have other people on the team that work with us so that we can keep everything rolling. But I'm fortunate that I live very close to work. So it's like I don't have a long commute and I can balance both.
That's really cool. That's really cool. And I hope you don't mind me poking your brain because I'm a
Yeah.
podcaster. Of course, I want to ask the award-winning podcast host who's been doing it for 9 years. Want to like get all of the secrets and insider information. So, who do you like? Who else is working on it with you? And kind of like what's in it for them? You know what I mean? Like, are they? And how did you meet up with them? Are they doing because they want the experience, or are you guys doing sponsorships and it's helping supplement your income?
Yeah. So the show, like once I started with interns and, people then having roles like marketing roles and video production roles, most of them are people that want to go into genetic counseling. So this is an experience for them to be able to, boost up their resume and have exposure and experience within the field of genetics, because getting into genetic counseling grad schools, which is required to be a genetic counselor, you need to have a graduate level education in genetics. And so it's really competitive to get into these schools. So it's about a 30% acceptance rate. So a lot of people are, looking to see how can they improve their application, but also beyond that of just how can I start getting involved in the field before I have degrees and before I have something that would allow me to step right into that genetic counseling role. So I'm really fortunate that we have an awesome team that's, ever growing. And so Laura Markham was our first person, and she was our marketing director for 2 years. And she recently left DNA Today, but her, everything that she's really contributed still, is really gone a long way with the show. And we have someone that we're just added a YouTube channel. So I am a audio podcaster. So I'm really getting into the video, but it's very new to me. So Sophia Salandino is doing all of our, video side and producing and all of that I really am such a novice with. So I really look for her for advice with that. And someone else working with us is Corinne Merlin, and she is working on a lot of the like marketing side and doing a lot of the social media and some of the outreach. So, we're all kind of figuring out our roles and we're all working together to just see how we can expand the show and reach more people.
Well, I think it probably speaks to your talent and your leadership abilities to be able to track those high quality, talented people to come and work on this with you. So that's pretty awesome. Just shifting gears a little bit into how you got started in, in genetic counseling. Do you think the podcast played a role in helping shape what direction you wanted to go in? Genetics is a pretty broad field. There's a lot of different things that you could do in that space, but you landed on genetic counseling. Do you think the podcast, or were there any particular guests that maybe helped influence the decision to go into that direction?
Yeah, definitely. So I think once I heard about the field of genetic counseling, I was super intrigued. I was like, oh, you get to talk about genetics all day. I mean, that's pretty much who I am. So I was like, that seems like a pretty good setup. And so I ended up getting my undergrad degree in diagnostic genetics. So focusing in on cytogenetics, so like the karyotypes I mentioned, so taking pictures of chromosomes and then analyzing them. So there isn't an undergrad degree in genetic counseling. So I was like, well, I have to do something genetic so I can get to grad school. And with that, I was I was in a lab, so doing, the genetic testing with the karyotypes and looking at the chromosomes. And that was kind of an affirming experience to say, okay, I'm not a lab person, of someone that can, have such patience and diligence to go through, different experiments and watch cells grow. And there's so much patience that go with it. And, I just was such a people person, and I really enjoy talking with people. And so kind of seeing that, okay, this seems like, that genetic counseling is the right route for me. And so during the early years of the show, I interviewed a genetic counselor, Ellen Matloff, who has her own company in Connecticut. And so, with this was one of my first interviews with a genetic counselor. And so right away, I was like, oh, what she does sounds really exciting, and having her own company and seeing that as something that, maybe one day I'd want to do and turn the show into. So, hearing her perspective, and she works in cancer genetic counseling. That's her background, that she started the Yale Cancer Genetic Counseling Program. And so, hearing from her, that was so exciting. And then right away, she was like, well, do you want to come work for the company? And I was like, wow, okay, sure. And so that, through the podcast is how I've landed most of my jobs and new experiences and
Oh,
opportunities. So I can certainly cite the podcast as kind of being the door to get into all those places and have those conversations. So it's certainly, I wouldn't have had a lot of the roles that I do today if it wasn't for the podcast.
yeah, that's one of the things I love about podcasting and doing the YouTube channel is it is a sort of self-promotion thing where people can see you. They can see you in a way that they can't see you through just a resume. And I think
Right.
that goes a long way, especially with something where you're interfacing with patients and people who are dealing with real life stuff that's pretty big. You want to make sure you have the right people for that. So, how many years now would you say you've been a genetic counselor?
So I just graduated in May 2020. So
Oh, wow,
officially,
congrats.
thanks. Yeah. So class of 2020, that will forever follow me, huh?
Yeah.
So I started my position in August because I wanted to take my boards exam first and get that out of the way. So I started my position in August, but I mean, I've been working in the field probably since I started working for Ellen Matloff at her company, My Gene Counsel. But, like I'd say officially August 2020, but, kind of just experience and getting my foot in the door beforehand.
Now, you mentioned you do prenatal genetic counseling. Is that something you chose, or is that something that you sort of fell into through your experiences?
Yeah. So before I went to grad school, I was thinking like, well, I'd like to end up in prenatal genetic counseling, but I was like ready to have my mind changed. You go through and rotate through different internships. And so you're in different specialties in genetic counseling in grad school. So you go through pediatrics, cancer, prenatal, and some other random experiences and specialties, such as like some people go into neurogenetics. So I was able to experience that at Cornell. And so you experience lots of different aspects of genetic counseling, and really genetic counselors can work anywhere in healthcare, which is such an exciting area to go into because you're not boxed into like, okay, you graduate with this and now you have to do this job for 50 whatever years. With genetic counseling, there's just so many ways that you can pivot your career. So I ended up sticking with prenatal and really just loving, talking with pregnant people and talking to them about their pregnancies and helping them understand the genetics and figure out, do they want testing? Do they not want testing? What does the testing entail? And so I find that to be really exciting to just to be able to be a part of their process and part of their journey.
Well, let's walk through that a little bit because that's something I don't know a lot about. I don't know that a lot of my audience knows a lot about that either. Um, when does a pregnant mother get introduced to the idea that there's this thing called genetic testing and you might want to do it? I would imagine every pregnancy goes through some assay of tests for the development of the child and the mother, and a sort of pre-screening. I don't know much about that. Can you walk us through, like, okay, I, not me, but imagine I'm pregnant and I go to the doctor and I confirm it with the doctor I'm pregnant. At what point does the genetic testing and counseling come into play?
So typically I'll see patients between 9 and 13 weeks of pregnancy, so right around 2 months. So after, they've had a pregnancy confirmed and other things that, happen at that point, ultrasounds and checking in, they would meet with me as a genetic counselor, and I would go through, check in, see how their pregnancy is going, ask about their pregnancy history. Is it their first pregnancy? Is it their seventh pregnancy? Go through what their experience has been so far, and then talk about family history. So that is a huge aspect of genetic counseling, regardless of what specialty you work in. Everybody takes family history. And so family history means the health medical information of family members. So for me, I ask about like immediate family members of the pregnant person's parents, their grandparents, children they have, their siblings,
And so
and then,
sorry to interrupt you, like, are
yeah.
you in an OBGYN's office? Are you in just a regular doctor's office? Or is this the place where you at? It sounded like it was like genetic counseling focused.
Mm-hmm.
So mothers
So
are calling and making the appointment in advance, knowing that that's something they want to do.
Right. So I work in a maternal fetal medicine specialty. So we're like for high risk pregnancies, private practice. So, when we do have a OB aspect as well, but I am primarily meeting with, obviously the pregnant patients.
So they're getting referred maybe to you guys?
Yeah. So some
Oh,
of our
okay.
patients we see for OB, and then if they're pregnant, then we're kind of, switching them over. Oh, now we're seeing you for a lot more appointments than just once a year.
Got it.
And then we have some patients that are referred to us because their place where they're going to appointments for their pregnancy doesn't have a genetic counselor. So they end up popping over to us to meet with me and talk about this. And so, part of that information, with that medical history and seeing when the family is, I'm looking for, is there any conditions that are being passed down through the family? Is there any red flags that I'm saying, maybe I'm thinking of condition A, or, what if someone's a carrier of another condition? And so with that, then talking about, is there risk to the pregnancy? What are we seeing with family history? And then getting into the genetic testing, as you were talking about. So, going through the different types of tests and if that's something they'd want to do. So for the, the genetic side and how it actually works, I think is really interesting. And I think patients are always like a little amazed of like, you can get all that from a blood test. So the way I explain it to patients is there's cells that come off their placenta that float in their bloodstream. And those cells tend to pop open and release their DNA. So that's the DNA being tested.
Wow. Wow. Okay, I want to dig into so many so many aspects of
Yes.
this, and I may
No, I'm
ask
throwing a
really
lot
dumb
out at
questions
once
because
here.
there's probably a lot of these questions that the average woman already knows, and I'm a guy, and so I don't think about them. So like things like the different kinds of tests and whatnot. There's probably women going, of course I would do that test. Um, okay, so got it. You've got the family history because you want to make sure that you can make appropriate recommendation for a test that will cover the potential risk area that they may have that's indicative from their family history.
Mhm.
And,
Yes.
and so, okay, so you said that there's a cell that'll come off the placenta and just go into the bloodstream and naturally release its DNA. Like, is that just when you're pregnant? That's just a part of the biological processes? It's always happening?
It is, yeah. So it's something that was a really big discovery because we're like, wow, we can actually look at DNA from the pregnancy just from taking a blood sample from mom. Most people are like, oh,
Is it
some
the
people,
embryo cells or it's like, yeah, is
yeah.
it the growth?
So if we think about when the sperm meets the egg and creates an embryo, that embryo ends up implanting into the uterus. And so at that point, we have cells growing and growing and expanding. And so the cells that end up, being tested in this from the blood test are cells that come off the placenta. Most of the time, the placenta and baby have the same cells, same DNA. Very rarely is there a difference there, and we call that something called mosaicism, where we have two cell lines where some cells are normal, some cells aren't normal. But in the vast majority of cases, the cells from the placenta are the same as baby. So
Oh,
by looking at
interesting.
those cells, we can get information about the baby.
See, I would have thought, and this is just my lack of understanding, I would have thought the placenta would be the mother's cells, and then what's inside of it would be the baby's. But you're saying
Right.
that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So these cells naturally are going through the biochemical processes and breaking down and entering into the bloodstream and whatnot. But what causes the DNA to exit the cell? I mean, is that a normal occurrence for all of us where we just have free floating DNA? Because what I do is not really on humans, it's on fungi, but one of the things we have to do is actually open the cell up and get the DNA out of it.
Yeah, so this is a natural process that happens, and there's some cancer genetic testing that can, it's called a liquid biopsy. So it's the same concept where it's looking at DNA that has popped out of a cell. And so in the cancer realm, this is something that's really, in the early stages from my understanding, but that, we can look at that DNA and see, okay, is there any changes there? Do we see any markers of cancer there? And that's something I go through with my pregnant patients because it's possible, because we're looking at cell-free DNA, that some of it could be from her. And if that's different than we expect, then that could represent that the pregnant person has cancer themselves. So that's something that very, very, very rarely comes up. But it's the same concept. And it's just interesting if we're getting into the particulars with it, that, there's different ways that in the lab that they actually do the testing. And one of those ways is to look at, okay, how long is that DNA piece? Is
Hmm.
it long or is it really short? And they found that the really short segments are more likely to be from the placenta and then representing the pregnancy.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a couple different ways to do it, but I found that was interesting that they're able to, that's one of the ways that they can look at, okay, is this DNA coming from the pregnant person? That, we don't really care about that so much, in my realm in terms of prenatal, or is it coming from the placenta? And that's what we care about. We want to see, for people that decide to do testing, is that normal and all coming back normal, or is there a difference there?
Are there any tests that like every pregnant person should do this, should get at least this baseline set of tests?
So when I sit and talk with patients about testing, I start by saying all of this is optional. And so, I go through, and my job is to educate them and make sure that they're making a decision that's good for them and their family and their partner. So I would say there's no test that I'm like, oh, everybody should have,
Hmm.
because some people wouldn't want this information. So it's kind of playing out, okay, if most people want to hear that everything is normal, nothing's coming back different. But, for those cases where we are seeing something different, where we're saying, there's a high chance there could be a genetic condition there, at that point, it's like, okay, well, what do we do with that information? And so for some people, that would mean ending a pregnancy. For other people, that might mean learning more about the condition and meeting other parents with a child with that condition, getting involved in the community, doing research, learning about doctors that maybe they'll be meeting with for their child. So, it's playing that out. And some people say, for me, this would just give me anxiety. I don't want to know
Hmm.
this information. Even if I
That's a good
had it, it
point.
wouldn't change, my pregnancy management. I would continue the pregnancy. So it's kind of playing all that out and seeing what works for people and what information they really want to have.
Interesting. I know there's a lot of different conditions that can be tested for. Things like Down syndrome, I believe, is something to be tested for. Is that done with a DNA test, or are there other ways of doing those kinds of screens?
Yeah, so this test we've been talking about, I'll give it a name too, because I feel like we're kind of talking a little abstract. So the general name for it is non-invasive prenatal screening. So non-invasive just because it's a blood test, and then prenatal screening. So it's quite a generic name. And different companies have their own names for it. Another general name for it is cell-free DNA, which makes sense the way we've been talking about the test. And so some of the conditions that this testing is looking for is conditions like Down syndrome, where we have an extra chromosome, an extra chromosome 21, or other conditions where we have extra chromosomes, or if we're missing a chromosome, or if there's a little piece of a chromosome missing. So those are the types of disorders that are looked at with this testing.
Yeah, interesting. And okay, cool, very cool. Um, yeah, I would imagine. it can be a little bit scary to get more information than you're anticipating.
Yeah.
Have you, so I want to ask about like different use cases or scenarios that maybe you've encountered. What what would you say are some of the more common occurrences of genetic, I don't want to say, let's say abnormalities that you come across on a sort of day-to-day basis? And do you see any trends occurring? Like, do you see any more occurrences of something happening? And that would be interesting.
Yeah, so Down syndrome is certainly the most common condition, and most people have heard of Down syndrome. So that one is one that people are more aware of, and they have a sense of what the condition is. There's certainly other conditions where we have like an extra chromosome. So we call having an extra chromosome trisomy because we have 3 copies of a chromosome. Normally we have 2. So I'm assuming I've done my karyotype, so I know I have 2 copies of each chromosome, but I would assume the same for you, Josh. And so, we're looking to
I don't
see, is
know,
there any
questionable
missing?
sometimes.
Questionable there, right? We'll have to draw you up in the lab. But so we're looking to see, is there, conditions there? And in terms of trends, something that we've, learned in the medical field is that as women get older, our eggs are not as good about counting our chromosomes. So there's a higher likelihood that we will have a child that has an extra chromosome. So like
What do you
Down
mean by
syndrome.
counting? What do you mean? I've never heard of that, said
So
that
kind of
way
just
before.
using like general, it's not like our cells are
Oh,
actually able to
okay.
count, but
Got it,
just
got
in
it.
terms of people understanding. So there's a higher likelihood of having an extra chromosome in our
Yeah.
cells, and just to do with meiosis and having the cells
So,
separate and making sure there's the right amount of chromosomes in each.
yeah.
I kind of think about it and I explain to patients it's sort of a skill we lose over time. Sperm, we don't see that, but for eggs, we do.
Interesting. So interesting. So is it fair to say sperm doesn't degrade at the same amount or the same rate as eggs do with age?
Yeah, so I don't know all the particulars on it, and I kind of want to do like a deep dive on it one of these days. But one of the ways I think about it, and I don't know if this is true, but just in my mind and how I'm kind of taking in the information, is that for females, we're giving 1 egg every month or so, right?
Mm.
About every 28 days. And for males, every time they ejaculate, you have millions of sperm. So numbers wise, you've got a lot more there. And we think of that analogy as like the best swimmer ends up winning the race. And so, that may also play a role with it. So I don't
Different
know all the
evolutionary,
particulars.
yeah,
Yeah.
different evolutionary pressures on men and women, I think, that are kind of driving some of those things. So that's kind of interesting. And I also like noticed that some of the tests involve sort of looking at, this is non-scientific, so this is just my amateur brain here going, some of the things seem to be kind of meta. You're looking at like the number of chromosomes, but you're not actually looking at the underlying nucleotide sequences. You're first just looking at the general structure. Is there a difference in how you classify the different type of analysis you do on sort of like the overall structure versus, you know what, you have the sequence here is not right, or there's some sort of mutation?
Yeah, definitely. And it's going to depend on what disorders you're looking at. If we're taking Down syndrome as an example, you're just counting the chromosomes because it's an entire extra chromosome. We don't need to do sequencing for that. So you're literally looking at a picture of the chromosomes and you're like, there's the extra one.
So it's a
So that's
different,
very
it's
straightforward.
even a different, so that's interesting. So you're not, what is, do you know that, I don't want to get too technical and ask you questions that you maybe don't think
Well,
about
let's see
ever,
if I
but
know.
okay, so that's cool. So like, how the hell do you count a chromosome? Like, I'm familiar with how sequencing works and, but yeah, how do you count chromosomes? That's interesting.
So for that, that's like the cytogenetics aspect. So that's what I ended up doing my undergrad in.
Okay.
When we're counting chromosomes, when we're looking at the chromosomes, the actual picture of them, that's what a karyotype is. So
How
we,
do you get the blood? How do you zoom into the blood to where you can see and count the number of chromosomes? And like,
yeah,
I would imagine blood has gazillions of copies of the DNA. So how do you isolate it down to just one cell, I guess?
yeah. So it's quite a process from start to finish. But the basic steps of it is that you're isolating the cells. So you want to get the white blood cells. And so you're using a centrifuge to spin it down. And so you can get that buffy coat. And hopefully I'm remembering all this right, because now it's been a couple of years since I've done this in the lab. But you're focusing in on, okay, let's get those cells, and then eventually getting a pellet with that. And then you're physically dropping them on slides so that the cells can break open.
Oh,
And
okay.
so, right before that, you're swelling the cells. So they're really swollen and they're ready to break as
Oh,
soon as they drop. So you have it in a pipette and you have your slide and you just squeeze it on, and you have to have all these perfect things. Humidity's got to be right. You got to be the
oh,
right
interesting.
angle, the right distance from the slide. And so if you drop it on the slide and then they land and burst, and then you are able to, I don't remember all the proper terms, but basically like freeze the slide and say, okay, let's stop it at this right point.
Oh, wow. What kind of
And then
microscope is this? This is not the one I
know,
have
just
behind me. I know that.
it might be. I think it's more the process of actually just getting the cells on the slide, because then once it's on the slide and you can stain it so that you end up having what's called a banding pattern. So then you can analyze the chromosomes of like, oh, it's missing a little piece, or it has an extra piece, or maybe it's flipped. So you're able to then, once you have those cells on the slide, you put it under your microscope. And I'm trying to remember like what number I would use on the microscope. I don't know, like 40x or something, I think usually
Wait, you could
to
see
then look
human
at.
chromosomes with just 40x?
I think so. 40x, 100x, something around there.
I mean,
It's
that
been a
microscope
while,
will go
but
to 2000x. So, and I have blood to try, so I would love
yeah.
to. I would love to see your protocol
I'll have
for.
to send you the protocol. I'll have to get it
Yeah,
out
send
of storage.
me. I
Yeah.
think people would love to see that done because
Yeah.
I just think DNA is. I think of it as being so incredibly small, but you're talking about chromosomes, which are wound up and probably a larger structure than the strands of
Oh,
individual
definitely.
DNA.
Yeah.
They
Cause it's
have to be
got,
if you could see them with something less
yeah.
than 1000x.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you're looking straight at the chromosome. So when people are, cytogeneticists, cytotechnologists, they're sitting in the lab, with those slides, and they're looking at the chromosomes and analyzing them. And, right from that, and they do band for band. Okay, is every band there that's supposed to be? Is there any
So there's
missing? Is there any
bands.
extra? Yeah. So you're looking at, it's kind of like a barcode. I'll send you my karyotype so you
I would
can
love
take a
that.
look
No,
at mine. Yeah.
I've seen like black and white photos of chromosomes. The little X's are sort of joined in the middle.
Yep. Yeah.
But is that kind of what they look like when you're looking at them?
Yeah, pretty
How do
much.
you know? How do you like? Let's say you see a bunch of these chromosomes. How do you know you're not getting some from one cell and some from another cell, and they're all mixing together and you miscount them?
So sometimes that happens. You can see like a bunch of cells together, and then you keep going on your slide because you're like, there's no way I can analyze that information. But
Oh,
that's part of the art of having that perfect height when you're dropping cells to hit those slides to pop open. And sometimes it doesn't work, and you're like, oh, this is chromosome soup. We can't do anything with this. And then other times you're like, oh, this is a pretty nice perfect circle. I can analyze this and look for everything. And sometimes you're like, oh, I seem to be missing a chromosome, and then you're kind of going around your slide. You're like, oh, maybe it drifted off somewhere. So
yeah.
it's certainly kind of like a different kind of science. I think when people hear of that, they're like, it sounds archaic and also very revolutionary at the same time.
It sounds like I know what I'm doing this weekend. I'm going to be counting
Yeah.
chromosomes. It sounds really cool. Um, so have you noticed any trends though in DNA related abnormalities? Like what I'm getting at is we're constantly under a changing environment. The technology is changing our environments, and I'm wondering if you're seeing any new occurrences of genetic illnesses, or maybe things are getting better, not necessarily worse.
So I think our ability to identify them has gotten much better. And I think that's what's really changed. So, back in history, these genetic conditions were still happening. People still had them, but we probably didn't have the name for it. We didn't have the technology we do now, especially with sequencing. I mean, total game changer. Now we can actually look and say, oh, there's a change in this gene that's leading to your symptoms. And that means you have this disorder. So I think that's been like the big really change since the Human Genome Project and just all of the advancements from that. And I think with that, of people now wanting to screen ahead of time. So before they get pregnant, before they're trying to conceive and say, okay, is there a chance I could pass on a condition to a child, even though I'm healthy myself? And so that's the other type of testing that I talk to
Hmm.
patients about. You could do this during pregnancy as well. I do it all of the time for my patients. Um, but if I, would say like, when's the best time to do it is before you're trying to conceive. And so this is looking to see, we have 2 copies of each gene. And so for someone to be a carrier of one of these conditions to possibly pass it on, one of those copies doesn't work. So you have 2 copies. As long as one works, you're healthy, which means maybe the other one doesn't work.
Oh,
And
we
so
had
if
two
you,
copies because we got one from our dad and one from our mom.
exactly,
And then they'll each have potentially slight mutations. But this is where I go back to our middle school and high school. If you've
the
got
Punnett
the
squares.
exactly, if you have the 2 big A's, then it's a dominant trait, right?
Right, right. Yeah. So it's looking to see, and we can now screen for hundreds of conditions with this. So in most people, if we're looking at hundreds of conditions, they come back as a carrier for something. And so, for most of those conditions, both partners, so both mom and dad, or, egg donor, sperm donor, whatever the
Yeah,
situation
yeah.
is, both of them need to be a carrier of that condition for there to be a chance that the child is. So
Yeah.
thinking about that Punnett square, okay, 50% chance that you pass on that bad copy, which, now we're using very layman's terms here, but, 50% chance you pass on that copy that doesn't work. 50% chance your partner passes down that copy that doesn't work. So that ends up being a 1 in 4 chance. So 25% chance that the child would be affected by that condition if both parents are a carrier of that condition. And we find that about 1 in 22 couples are a carrier of the same condition, which means
Huh.
it's not super common, but it's also not super rare. It's kind of in the middle there.
It's higher than I would have thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many folks, because the abundance of different DNA testing services out there has like exploded in the last 5 to 10 years, about the same time you've been doing this. Or do you have people that are coming to the office going like, I did 23andMe and it said that I have this thing, and is that going to affect the pregnancy? Are you finding that happening more frequently?
Yes, I think more with ancestry, because I ask what countries their ancestors are from. And so sometimes they'll give me well, this percent this percent this is what ancestry.com said, this is what 23andMe said, which is always interesting. But in terms of more of the medical side information, I certainly have people bring up that, oh, I came back as having a variant or a change in this gene, and kind of talking through like, okay, does that affect anything, for the pregnancy? Is there a chance you could pass that down? What is that chance? And so certainly kind of having those conversations, which is certainly different than before we had this direct consumer genetic testing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. It gives you a little bit more scientific basis behind the family history, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah, certainly.
So the tests that are screening for individual genes, I presume those tests are testing in known locations for where those genes live?
Yeah, so they're testing certain genes that we know, okay, if you have a change in that gene that leads it not to work, as we were talking about before, then, someone can have that condition, whatever gene that's associated with that condition. So, and the testing is done differently with every lab. Some of the testing is only looking at hotspots on the gene that we know, like, oh, this is a very well-known change. Let's look for that specific change.
I see.
Other places
Like
are
a
saying,
specific
well,
allele, like this A should be a T, and if it's not, then we're worried about
exactly.
that.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's certainly well-known changes for certain conditions. So an example, like a condition like cystic fibrosis, there's a certain change, Delta 508, that is very well known. A lot of people with cystic fibrosis have at least one of the Delta 508 changes that's leading to the disorder. And then, so some places are, again, looking at like those hot spots of like, changes that we know really well. And then other companies are reading through the entire gene and saying, okay, let's not just look at the hotspots, let's read through everything and see if we can find any changes. And then it becomes difficult of, okay, we found a change, but what if we don't know what that change means? It could just be, human diversity and how we're all different and just the beautiful side of that. Or it could be, well, maybe this makes the gene not work. And that's an area of genetics that is just exploding as we get, all of this big
The
data and
data.
figuring out, of like, okay, we can find a change in a gene, but like, what does that mean? So in science, I feel like we're really good about finding things, but then figuring out like, okay, what does this mean for someone? What does this mean for a disease is like the next step with it all.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like that opportunity is growing every day because the cost of sequencing is dramatically lowered over the last, several years, and therefore we can get more data cheaper and easier, which kind of leads me to my next question, which is, do the patients who get the testing have the option to share their data back with the scientific community so that further analysis can be done? And I would imagine it's incredibly useful to have all of this genetic data, and then even to like follow up with like post birth to kind of go, did that change actually have an impact on on the child? um, does anything like that happen, or is that more like there's a specific study and they kind of have to like opt into it or something?
So it's kind of both. There's certainly studies that, are consenting patients. Okay, we're doing this research. This is exactly what we're doing, and onboarding patients in terms of a certain research study. And then there's also that aspect that, in the US, we have such an interesting market of, private companies that are doing medical testing where we don't see that in other areas of the world. I was talking to someone in the UK and they were just asking me questions about that because they're like, it's so weird. Like you choose like a company to like order testing from. And I was like, yeah, it is weird when you think about it from an outside perspective. But they certainly are doing their own internal research. And so sometimes if I have, a genetic test come back, a high chance for a certain condition to happen, they will ask later and follow up and say, hey, did you have any follow up from that? Was the baby born? Was that genetic condition there? Did they end up doing any testing to confirm that? So, it certainly helps pay it forward and make the testing better so that they can say, okay, these are all the tests where we said there was a high chance for that to happen. And then it did. And then learning from that. So it's certainly an important aspect of just science in general to say, okay, can we, and you were talking about this on your last episode, I think too, that, replicating science and saying, okay, like, do we see this over and over and being more confident in that research?
Yeah, absolutely. Are centers where you work, are you guys doing the sequencing in-house, or are you guys, outsourcing it to third-party labs?
So we outsource it. So we don't do any genetic testing at the practice. I work at a fairly small practice, so that would be quite remarkable if I could like meet with the patient and then go in my little personal lab. Maybe that's a dream someday. But no, we send it all to certain companies that we've vetted over time, and we're always meeting with new companies and saying, okay, what do you offer, and how is this better than the company we're ordering from now? And so certainly kind of looking at that, and it's always interesting because I'll tell patients, oh, we're sending your sample to Utah, or oh, we're sending your sample to California, and especially if a kid's present, they're like, really? Wow, it's going all the way there. And so it's certainly interesting because I think a lot of other tests just end up getting sent to like a lab at the nearby hospital. But for genetic counselors, we're always like FedExing samples overnight. A lot to Utah. Salt Lake City has a lot of genetic testing companies there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. If you had like a nerd patient like me that was interested in seeing the underlying like sequence data, is that something that's available? Does anyone ever ask for that and say like, can you send me the sequences?
I'm waiting for the day that happens. I haven't had that in prenatal, certainly in other areas that I was working in as like a student. That was part of like their process when they did testing, that they were doing like whole exome sequencing. So that was part of it, like that they would get that information. But in terms of like my role now, I haven't had that. And I don't know how much, with like the carrier testing we talked about of looking at hundreds of genes, certainly they have a lot of information from there. But as far as I know, I don't think patients can like download their raw report or anything like that. I think there'd be a lot of problems with uploading to third parties like Prometheus and just like,
Yeah.
okay, is that legit? And, you don't want to create confusion for patients and have a lawsuit on your hands. So I don't imagine that's available. Certainly is a good question for a lab
Plus,
to
I'd say
see.
probably say the average mother just wants to make sure everything's okay and isn't like, yeah,
Right.
probably doesn't have a lot of interest in digging into the sequence data itself.
Right.
I want to talk
But
about
that could
treat.
change in the future. Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah, definitely. I want to talk about treatment options because something I keep hearing a lot about is gene therapy, and some of the different gene therapy options, or most of them actually, are only effective at very, very early stages of the pregnancy, just the nature of that. Has any of that actually made it to the market to where you can offer that to your patients? Where does that fit
So
in with treatment options?
yeah. So I think, being in the prenatal side, it's a little bit different for me because I'm, the patient we're talking about isn't born yet. So it's certainly like a more unique aspect of that.
Hmm.
But for people that are more in the pediatric side or like adult genetics, where you're meeting with people with conditions, that's a little bit different and, more related to that. But I think we have a long way to go with gene therapy. I think CRISPR has offered, which is a genetic editing tool, kind of like molecular scissors, where you can cut a gene out and paste another one in. And so I think that is going to be like, and it already is becoming like the new revolution in terms of gene editing and gene therapy with that. But I think we still have a long way to go. I don't know as much about the particulars of like what's offered, the market right now,
Yeah,
but not much from what I understand.
like if I was going to have a child and and it came back that there was one of those single nucleotide differences that I think you said causes, I forget what the disease was that you said earlier that
Something like
it
cystic
yes,
fibrosis.
yeah.
Yeah.
What treatment option is available, or right now are there no treatment options available, and is this sort of like a go no go go no go decision on having the child?
Yeah. So for most conditions, there's not a cure and treatment is usually quite limited. Cystic fibrosis is a really interesting disease because the research and drug development for that has just been remarkable over the past 50 years. And just, it's so interesting. If people are interested in learning about that, you should read Breath from Salt. It is a fantastic book. I just finished it. It's a long read, but it's a really good read that just provides so much information with that. And the author is going to be coming on the show soon on DNA Today. But, that's an example of something that, they had to put millions, maybe even $1 billion into drug development and specifically for different genetic mutations and figuring out, okay, for patients that have, as I mentioned before, the most common mutation is that Delta F508 gene mutation. And so, for that, there is specific drugs that have been developed to really help combat the disorder and the certain symptoms that are with it. So, I think looking at diseases like cystic fibrosis, like spinal muscular atrophy is another one that is just remarkable. Of the development of Spinraza has just been it's amazing. Like I'm like speechless even just talking about it because that's a disorder where um, people have severe muscle problems and die at a young age, and now they're seeing that with this new drug Spinraza, we are seeing patients just doing really well with it and living way longer than we expected. So I think conditions like cystic fibrosis, like spinal muscular atrophy, is giving us hope and like, wow, we've been able to develop drugs that have really made a big impact. And so I think that's going to be happening more and more, especially with just the new technologies coming out. And there's a new company called nLorem, and I recently had their founder on the show. And so, and he talked about like just doing this and like how, he was involved with this development of Spinraza and talking about how even for ultra rare conditions where you only have like maybe, 1 or 30 people in the entire world with a condition, developing drugs just for them. So I think, right now there's not a whole long list, but that's really going to change in the next few years.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like any of the CRISPR technology has made it to market in terms of being available treatment, but that's what's on the horizon.
Yeah, from what I understand, there's been a few clinical trials, and probably more than a few now that I've, it's been a while since I've read up on it. But certainly that's like the direction I think we're headed.
Yeah.
Just like one of the ways. It's certainly not the only one. But I mean, the discovery of that in like around 2012 or so, right, learning about it then was like, oh, this is going to be groundbreaking.
Yeah, yeah, it just makes sense, especially for some of those mutations that are not super complicated. If you can just go in and cut them out and replace the couple of letters that are in the wrong
Yeah.
place, or just flip a couple of bits, that's really, really exciting. Well, this is awesome. If people want to get a hold of you and listen to your podcast or just connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you and begin to follow DNA Today and you, Kira?
Yeah. So just searching DNA Today on any podcast app, the show should pop up. Our green DNA molecule is our logo there to find us. And going directly to the website, dnapodcast.com has really everything you need on there. The contact forum to email into info@dnapodcast.com. And just like you, we also joined YouTube. So you can certainly watch our episodes now that those are
Definitely
being
will.
filmed in video. So, but thank you so much for having me on the show, Josh. I mean, I feel like
Thanks.
I just like nerded out for an entire hour here with you,
Yeah,
but it was
you're
so
in the
fun.
right place to do that because
Right? Yeah. Yeah,
I had to
definitely.
hold back, honestly. So, no, thank you for actually supporting a new podcaster, and congrats to you and the journey that you've been on in the last decade. It's amazing, and you've got a new fan here, and I'll be following you guys, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And just good luck with your show and everything. It's, such a strong start. And I definitely look back at early episodes of my show, it pales in comparison to this. So no, congrats on launching this show and stick with it. And you've got some really interesting episodes. So I'm excited to keep subscribing.
Thank you so much, Kira. Have a great one.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.